Good evening. Appreciate you guys being here. We're going to open our Bibles and spend some time in 1 Samuel. Last week we saw the end of Samuel's life. Tonight we're going to go backwards a little bit and into 1 Samuel chapter 17, and we're going to pick up the early life of David and look at the Goliath story. When we were in chapter 16 last week, really the stress of the text is leadership qualities as observed by others. And we saw the closing days of Samuel, and we looked at the way Israel saw him, those external qualities that made him received in the nation as a great leader. We followed that all the way to his death in chapter 25, but we're going to come back to chapter 17 because we're going to look at what I've called leadership by faith. We're going to see in David what God saw, which is unlike Samuel, who at the end of his life his leadership qualities were on display. They were externally observable. For David, especially early on, he's marked by inner qualities, hidden qualities, if you will. And those inner qualities, those character traits will eventually make their way to the surface, and Israel will someday acknowledge that David was the greatest king, and the golden age of Israel was during his reign. But here we have a young man who knows himself well. In fact, we talked about that. Because of the time that he spent with God in the lonely place as a shepherd, David had a pretty good grasp of who he was. And he understood not only who he was, but the way God had made him, the way God had gifted him. That confidence that comes with recognizing the work of God in your life and what God has done to prepare you, that kind of leadership confidence is pretty rare in our day, actually. Polls consistently show that evangelical Christians rank among the lowest demographic groups in polls related to self-esteem. That is, we don't have confidence in ourselves, and we view that typically as some kind of pious reality. I'm just being humble. Humility is not thinking poorly of yourself. Humility is thinking properly of yourself. And the problem with evangelical Christians typically is that while the Protestant Reformation was an extraordinary movement historically of the Spirit of God, and really it revitalized the church that in the late Middle Ages was sort of on life support. The corruption of church leadership, the materialism that had come to dominate the Roman Catholic Church, the lust for power that characterized 200 years of popes. By the time we get to the Protestant Reformation, we see a real resurgence of the moving of God's Spirit. But one of the downsides of the Protestant Reformation, particularly the Reformed branch of the Reformation, which is sort of the Ulrich Zwingli, John Calvin branch, one of the downsides of that part of the Reformation was this idea that because God is sovereignly responsible for salvation, and because salvation is completely by grace, the implication that we walked away with was that we are in a sense worms, if you will. We bring nothing to the table. There's no value in us. There's no quality in us that would lead us to aspire to do great things for the kingdom. And it's really a shame, because it's a poor understanding of the doctrine of salvation. We are separated from God by sin. Anything short of that is a dangerous place to be. We don't bring anything to the table when it comes to salvation. We're saved by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ applied to us by the declaration of God. We call it justification. But this idea that we have no value is an incorrect view of humanity. Because what we need to remember is that even though we are damaged by sin, in fact, the word iniquity in the Old Testament is a word that means twisted to the core. We're marked by something that is twisted, and it goes all the way to the core of who we are. But that doesn't negate the reality that we have in us the imago Dei, the image of God. We were created in the image of God, and because of that, we are foundationally different from any other beings on the planet. You see, the devilish part of evolutionary theory is it animalizes, I don't know if that's a word, it animalizes human beings. The suggestion of evolution is that we are simply the most advanced of the beasts on the planet. And we've bought into that, when in fact, the book of Genesis in the creation account says that God fashioned the man and the woman, and he endowed us with the image of God. And then he gave to us the responsibility to exert dominion over all the beasts of the field, all the animals on the earth. So the biblical testimony is we're not just a walking, talking, thinking animal. We are foundationally different from animals. That means that while we recognize that we are hopeless without the blood of Jesus Christ, we have to recognize that back in the 70s, there was I make fun of bumper sticker theology, but there was a common saying back in the 70s when I was a teenager, and I don't know where it came from, probably a song or something, but the phrase was, God don't make no junk. And there is some biblical value to a mindset that says, while I bring nothing to God, he needs nothing from me. And yet the whole point of the incarnation was God seeing in us such incredible value that he was willing to take the initiative to breach the chasm created in our relationship with him by sin. Now, the reason I lay all that background is because what we're going to find in David is a young man who, because of his walk with the Lord, he is going to stand out in his generation as someone who has confidence, but it's not confidence in himself, but it's confidence in who he is in his relationship with God. It's the Apostle Paul centuries later saying, if God is for us, then who can be against us? David understood that. And so in chapter 17, we're going to see this young man with really a level of esteem beyond his years stand out from the crowd because he has such confidence in himself, because he has such confidence in his God. The Wall Street Journal published an article a few years ago that said, on this topic, it said that people of low esteem can manage, but they can never lead. No one is really eager to be managed, however. The entire world is hungry to be led. You have to have a confidence. Leadership requires stepping out and making decisions and risking a lot of things. That's why low self-esteem people, they can manage. They can implement somebody else's direction. but they will never set the direction or lead the parade. Now, we're going to see three characters in this story. The first one is Goliath. Goliath is a Philistine soldier. The general estimate, and I don't want to get into a lot of critical theory. I take the Bible at face value. I take it for what it says. The description of Goliath says that he's roughly 9 foot 6 inches tall. Now, we have a lot of people, a lot of scholars who will say, well, that's a mistake. That's an error in the Word of God. That's probably a revision from somebody who was trying to maximize this giant. The fact that we don't know anybody that's 9 foot 6 inches tall doesn't mean that there could never have been somebody who was 9 feet 6 inches tall. And I think that rather than being an exaggeration, if Goliath had been just a larger version of the rest of the soldiers, I don't think we have the terror that we're going to discover in this chapter. I mean, look at Saul. Saul is on the Israel side of this battle. What we have is we're going to have the Philistine army on one mountain, and we're going to have the Israelite army on another mountain, and there's a valley between them. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But the Bible tells us that Saul was from his shoulders to the top of his head that much taller than all the rest of Israel. So if you took the tallest man in his army, he would have come right to here on Saul. So if we're talking about Goliath as just sort of an oversized Philistine, then we're probably looking at a pretty fair match between Goliath and Saul. Saul was, in effect, an oversized Israelite. So when the estimate is 9 feet 6 inches tall, I'm going to take that at face value, because a 9 foot 6 inch tall soldier wearing armor, the biblical account of his armor, if we translate it into our measuring system, his armor probably weighed about 200 pounds. Now, by all accounts, this is an out of the ordinary, an extraordinary soldier. He was heavily armed. His armor, as I said, weighed about 200 pounds. He had a shield bearer. That is, his shield was so large that he actually had a man walk in front of him carrying the shield. How'd you like to be that guy? Actually, it's probably the safest place on the battlefield, because it's got to be a shield big enough for that guy to hide behind. But he had to be pretty bulky himself to be able to carry it. He had a large shield with a shield bearer. He had a spear, a sword, and a javelin. But it wasn't just his impressive presentation and his weaponry. He was a braggart. He had an intimidating presence, but the most critical aspect of the character of Goliath was he had a complete and utter disdain for the God of Israel. That's going to be the key here. Not the 9 feet 6 inches, not the 200 pounds of armor, not the shield, not the weaponry, not the braggadocio personality. What's going to determine this battle will be two things: the disdain of the enemy for the God of Israel, and the faith of one soldier who knows who God is. Goliath's the first character in this story. The second character in this story is Saul. Saul is king. We know that he's tall, he's strong, he's handsome. He had his own armor, which was apparently fairly impressive. He had a brass helmet and a coat of chainmail. And yet, with all that he had, his weapons, his armor, his defensive clothing, his own impressive presence, he was absolutely intimidated by the odds of fighting a battle with Goliath. Why? Was it because his armor wasn't as good as Goliath's? Was it because his spear and his sword weren't as well made as that of Goliath? No. He's terrified of this confrontation Because while Goliath has a disdain for the God of Israel, Saul has a lack of confidence in the God of Israel. He would have probably said, if you pressed him, he probably would have said, listen, I know the God of Israel. I've seen him do stuff, but come on, 9 feet, 6 inches tall. See, here's the thing. That's exactly what we do. We say, Lord, I know that you've worked in my life. I know that you've done things. I've got a testimony of what you've done. But have you seen the next problem that I have? Have you looked at the next challenge? Let me tell you, I live with this reality. When this church started almost 26 years ago, I've told you this before, we had nothing. I mean, the way I've described it is we didn't own a paperclip. And it was like, God, we can't do this unless you do it for us. And he did. He did amazing things. Well, every now and again along the way, I'm like, God, listen, I know you've done great things for us, but look at what's ahead of us. Look at how big the next challenge is. Well, then God shows up and he does that and meets a need. Then we go a few years and I go, well, God, I've never been in a situation like what we're looking at now. I've had God tell me, you mean you've never been in a situation like we've had now? Every time there is this temptation to say, man, I'm facing a challenge bigger than I've ever faced before. I wonder if God is up for it. That's King Saul. I know about God. I believe in God. I've offered sacrifices to God, but seriously, there's a giant on the battlefield. Well, then the third character is David. The Bible tells us that David was ruddy, meaning he was dark-skinned. He was handsome. But at least in this story, David has no armor, no weapons except the sling that typically a shepherd boy would have carried with him. The living God, however, the difference here was the living God for David was an absolute moment-by-moment reality. He had no doubt in God's power and protection and presence. In other words, this is the guy who had the serious and even heroic faith. So, I've given you an outline to follow along. I mentioned in the introduction that the greatest stories in the Bible always seem to be these stories where one person accomplishes something great, and the only thing that makes that one person different from all of the other people around them is that one person is sold out to the true God. Whether it's Joseph before Pharaoh, or Moses in the wilderness, or Daniel in the lion's den, or this story of David and Goliath, it's this idea that God and me together, we make a majority in any battle. So let's look at this. So I'm going to read quite a bit of this chapter. Let's just start with verse 1 of chapter 17, and we'll work through the chapter. Now the Philistines gathered their camps for battle, and they were gathered at Soka, which belongs to Judah, and they camped between Soka and Azekah in Ephes Damim. But Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and camped in the valley of Elah, and arranged themselves for battle to meet the Philistines. Now the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, while Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with the valley between them. Then a champion came out from the camps of the Philistines named Goliath. He was from Gath, and his height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was clothed with scale armor, and the weight of that scale armor was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He also had bronze greaves on his legs, and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. And the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. His shield carrier also walked before him. And he stood and called out to the battle lines of Israel and said to them, Why do you come out to arrange yourselves for battle? Am I not the Philistine, and you slaves of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and strike me down, then we will become your slaves. But if I prevail against him and strike him down, then you shall become our slaves and serve us." Again the Philistine said, "I openly reproach the battle lines of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now, what's interesting about this is that this scenario is actually pretty ordinary for battle in the ancient world. You see, you've got an army on two mountains and a valley between. Here's the dilemma. There's several things to consider. Warfare in the ancient world was particularly costly. I mean, to recruit an army, to train an army, to equip an army, to sustain an army required nothing short of a small fortune. That's why you'll remember Israel originally wanted a king, because they wanted somebody who could create and sustain a standing army so that they could defeat their enemies. Because sustaining an army was so expensive, not only would a lost battle mean that you forfeited ground to an invading enemy, but with the army decimated, you also potentially destroyed your ability to have an economy or run a country because of the expense of losing a battle. Now, because both armies were on a mountain with a valley between them, there was real hesitation, frankly, by both leaders to initiate an attack, because the army that initiated the battle would have to come down from the mountain and be in the valley. They would forfeit the advantage of the high spot, the higher ground. So what they both were hoping for was that the other army would start the battle by moving forward, and you could then meet them, but you would be able to sustain higher ground for at least some of your army, particularly your archers. So there's reluctance to enter a battle that you weren't confident you were going to win because of the financial cost that it was going to hit you with, but also strategically, to initiate the battle was to forfeit the high ground and put yourself at a military disadvantage. Now, because of those kinds of considerations, it was not uncommon in the ancient world for two armies to square up against each other and then to agree to send out their champions and in hand-to-hand combat settle a battle by a representative of each army. Israel was probably aware that this was an option. They had just never seen an opponent like this come out as the champion of the opposing army. So they're reluctant to start the battle for a variety of reasons, but they're also overwhelmed by the particular challenge that's made here. He refers to the army of Israel as the slaves of Saul. He says, "I openly reproach the battle lines of Israel." That is a very polite translation of what he actually said. The Hebrew there is, he's basically throwing down curses against Israel. We translate it, it shows up here as reproach, and the New American Standard has declared it openly reproach to mean I publicly say this, but it was a pretty unseemly insult, basically, is what he's challenging Israel with. Now, this braggart, with his disdainful attitude towards God, his intimidating presence, he issues the challenge, and this goes on for days. Neither army willing to initiate the conflict, but Israel not willing to answer the call of the challenge. All right, verse 12. Now David was the son of the Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, whose name was Jesse, and he had 8 sons. And Jesse was old in the days of Saul, advanced in years among men. And the 3 older sons of Jesse had gone. They had gone after Saul to the battle, and the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and the second to him, Abinadab, and the third, Shammah. But David was the youngest. Now the 3 oldest had gone after Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to shepherd his father's flock at Bethlehem. Now that's interesting because we don't think about David having been there before. Apparently, before Goliath comes out to issue the challenge, David has already done what we're going to see him do in just a minute, which is he had served as a messenger between Jesse in Bethlehem and the 3 eldest brothers who were in the army of Saul. In the ancient world, I mentioned already how expensive it was to sustain an army. Because armies were often not given everything they needed, it was not uncommon for a family to provide food or even weaponry for their own family members who were a part of the army. They would supplement what the army had to offer. Apparently that's what's happening here, because Jesse is taking David and he's shuttling him back and forth between the site of the battle, or the potential battle, and his home, taking supplies to his brothers. Now verse 16. Then the Philistine approached morning and evening for 40 days and took his stand. Then Jesse said to David his son, take now for your brothers an ephah of this roasted grain and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to your brothers. You shall also bring these 10 cuts of cheese to the commander of their 1,000, and look into the welfare of your brothers, and bring back a token from them. Now, again, there's real evidence here of historicity. This is not a fable. This is not a parable. This is not a fairy tale. There are real hints here of things that would have been ordinary details from this kind of situation. Notice he says, I want you to take some food to your brothers. It's probably been a few days since David is gone. It's time to take them some more supplies. But he says, I also want you to take this gift to their commander. Listen, there's not anything stupid about that move. You know, I want the commander to show particular favor to my sons. So go take these supplies to your brother, take this gift to your brother's commander, and then come home with some token, some indication for me of how your brothers are doing. All of this is it has a very historical feel to it. Let's see. Verse 19, and Saul and they and all the men of Israel are in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So David arose early in the morning and left the flock with the keeper and carried the supplies and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the circle of the camp while the military force was going out in battle lines, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines arranged themselves in battle line against battle line. Then David left his baggage in the care of the baggage keeper and ran to the battle line and entered in order to greet his brothers. As he was speaking with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine from Gath, named Goliath, was coming up from the battle lines of the Philistines, and he spoke these same words, and David heard them. Now, let me pause there for a minute, because what we have here is that David is finally there on a day when he can hear the challenge of Goliath. There's one little note here that I don't want you to pass over. And it's real easy when we read the Bible to just sort of blaze right past details. But did you catch one little hint there where it said that his father said, I want you to go back. I want you to take these supplies to your brothers. And it says the next morning he got up and he made sure that there was a keeper who could take care of his sheep while he was gone. Listen, don't just blow right past that. What this tells us is that David was so conscientious as a young man, given certain responsibilities, that while he was going to be obedient to his father and make the trip to the battle lines, before he did, in effect, he got all of his ducks in a row. He got his sheep taken care of. He made arrangements It would have been easy. In fact, it might not even have been untypical for a young man like David, thrilled at the prospect of going to where the army is, for him to just get up and take off. But see, even at this very young age, he's already diligent about responsibility that's given to him. He finds a keeper for the sheep, and then he fulfills the orders that his father gave him. Now, he goes there, and he's there. He sees the battle lines, and he sees Goliath come up out of the battle line of the Philistines and present himself, speaking the same words that he had spoken every single morning, basically challenging Israel and cursing Israel, which in effect was cursing Israel's God. Verse 24. Now all the men of Israel saw the man, and they fled from him and were greatly afraid. Can you imagine how desperate it must have made that army feel to get out every morning and march out to battle, hoping that today Goliath wouldn't come out? I mean, at this point, they're probably hoping for a battle against the Philistine army. And every day they go line up, the battle lines are formed, the armies are facing each other, and then they hear it before they see it, and this monster of a man breaks through the line and comes out, and he issues the challenge. And Israel turns tail and runs. It doesn't say they did that every day for 40 days, but that's the implication. Maybe today the giant won't show up. Maybe today we can just fight. I mean, think about this. The Philistine army, even though it was probably bigger, it just doesn't look that scary compared to Goliath. They probably would have loved to have had a battle against the Philistines if they could have just gotten Goliath out of the picture. But every day for 40 days, he shows up. Verse 25. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who's coming up? Surely he's coming up to reproach Israel, and it will be that the king will enrich the man who strikes him down with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. In other words, the troops are already talking. I don't think that they've invented this. I think that this is already circulating as a reward. If Israel can come up with a champion, and if he can win, he will be rewarded beyond imagination. Then David spoke to the men who were standing by him, saying, what will be done for the man who strikes down this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? I don't know if you ever had a younger brother, but when David asked this question, I'm imagining that everybody in the room, particularly his three older brothers, who were like, what do you care? You're not going to be that guy. You know, what are you asking about the rewards for the person who challenges Goliath? That's just a ridiculous thing. Why don't you sit there in the corner and be quiet? What will be done for the man who strikes down this Philistine and takes away the reproach of Israel? And then I love this line. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should reproach the battle lines of the living God? That is a memory verse. When he calls him an uncircumcised Philistine, don't miss what that's about. He was not simply commenting on a particular physical feature of the giant. To be uncircumcised was David's way of saying this infidel, this man who would stand outside the favor of the God of Israel. To say uncircumcised, he's basically saying, who's this heretic that speaks this way about our God? And I love the way he finishes the sentence. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine? Wait a minute, I lost it. Oh, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should reproach the battle lines of the living God? Notice that every part of this story leading up till now, it's been the battle lines of Israel. For David, it's the battle lines of the living God. We already have a hint of what's different here. They're looking at themselves and comparing themselves to Goliath, and they're turning tail and running away afraid. David is the first one in the story who looks at God and compares Goliath to God. Not the battle lines of Israel, the battle lines of the living God. There's a principle right there for us. Take your eyes off the challenge, take your eyes off of the problem, take your eyes off of the difficulty that's in front of you, and put your eyes on God. And against God, no challenge, no difficulty, no problem looks quite as big. It's always about perspective. What looks overwhelming when I compare it to myself is never overwhelming when I compare it to God. The battle lines of the living God. Verse 26 is crucial to this story. We haven't even gotten to the place where David's going to volunteer, where he's going to march out there with a sling and 5 stones. We're nowhere near that. But let me tell you something. The battle has already been won. Because Goliath has set himself, by his own words, against the God of Israel. And David, by his words, has already testified that the God of Israel is the answer to this problem. The rest is just working out the details. The battle has been won already by the words of these 2 characters. Now, verse 27, the people spoke to him in accord with his words, saying, "Thus it will be done for the man who strikes him down." Then Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger burned against David, and he said, "Why have you come down, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I myself know your arrogance and the wickedness of your heart, for you've come down in order to see the battle." Doesn't that sound like an oldest brother talking to a youngest brother? He goes, "I bet you left those sheep unattended." Well, we know that he didn't. We have a higher opinion. Samuel had a higher opinion. God has a higher opinion than his own brothers. But where have we seen this before? Joseph. Joseph ends up being the number 2 man in the most powerful nation of the planet in his generation, and his brothers didn't think he was worth spitting on. What about Jesus? Jesus' brothers thought he was flipping out of his mind until after the resurrection. There's something about coming back to life that'll change people's opinions. This is a common theme. Family often underestimates because they see us based on how they've known us. But God sees us in the way that he's going to make us. Okay. Now, if verse 28 sounds like an older brother talking to a younger brother, verse 29 sounds like a younger brother's response. But David said, "What have I done now? Was it not just a word?" He's had this kind of attitude before. Okay, what have I done now? Verse 30, then he turned away from him to another and said the same word, and the people responded to him with the same word as before. In other words, if my brother's going to yell at me, I'll just go talk to somebody else about this. Verse 31, then the words which David spoke were heard, and they told them to Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Okay, in the conversation that David is having, he's asking, what's the reward if you kill this guy? His brother scolds him. You shouldn't even be in this conversation. Why don't you just go sit in a corner somewhere? David says, well, I'll just go talk to these guys. So he walks over and talks to these guys. What will happen to the guy who kills this pagan that's out here in the middle of the field? Well, somebody runs to Saul's headquarters, the tent where Saul is, and said, hey, we got a guy out here. Sounds like he's contemplating facing off against the giant. And Saul's like, bring him here. He didn't ask who he was, didn't ask what the conversation was. If there's any hope of somebody stepping up into this role, he's like, send him to me, let me see him. So David came in. He says, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Now this is his, he's very straightforward here. Understand, David is from all, except for God and Samuel, David is still an unknown quantity. His family doesn't have a high opinion of him, including his father. Certainly his brothers don't. The army looks at him like a kid, which he was. Saul only allows him to come have a conversation because he's desperate. And here's David with the kind of self-esteem that you can only have if you have an unshakable confidence in God. I'll go fight him. Somebody needs to. I mean, the true and living God is being embarrassed because nobody in the army of Israel has enough confidence to trust in God. I wonder how, I wish, the Bible has a real economy of language. And I wonder how this whole conversation went. It wouldn't have been out of line for David to go, remember when Moses was with those slaves in front of Pharaoh, the most powerful man on the planet? Remember when they were out in the desert and the most powerful army and their chariots were thundering toward them and God opened up the Red Sea? You remember all those battles that Joshua won against standing armies in the land of Canaan? Do you remember all the judges that were raised up generation after generation where God gave Israel a deliverer even though they seldom ever deserved one? I mean, David could have just ticked off. It is the history of Israel from start to finish to have been the underdog. Why? Because God kept Israel in a perpetual state of being the underdog because he owned all rightful credit. Could God have chosen the Assyrian army, the Babylonian army? Could he have chosen the Romans? Could he have chosen Alexander the Great? He could have. He'd have had a mighty army. He'd have had a conqueror who marched his armies off the map and left nothing behind except his own flags. But see, nobody's ever asked if Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar had divine help. They were great military men. God wanted a nation where everybody would look at them and go, how in the world did they win? And that becomes the jumping off place for a conversation about Israel's God. That's the way God works. The next time somebody comes to you and says, hey, we've got this need, this place. We need a servant leader at Evergreen to step into this role. And your first inclination is to say, I'm not really qualified for that. I want you to remember this story because the entire Bible is filled with people. In fact, it's Paul saying, I was the chief of sinners. It's Peter being called Satan by Jesus himself. You do realize that Jesus is the only person in the entire Bible who was fully adequate to the task that he was assigned. And yet we think we can't do something because we're not adequate. God's people have never been adequate. It's designed that way so that we depend on him and he receives glory. Why? Is God hungry for glory? No, it's in God receiving the glory out of our weakness that puts him on display and draws other people. Why? Because we all know how weak we are. Our self-esteem shouldn't be strong because we're all that. Our self-esteem should be strong because our God is all that. I'll go out and fight this Philistine. Verse 33. Then Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, while he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant was shepherding his father's sheep, and a lion and a bear would come and take a lamb from the flock, and I would go out after it and strike it and rescue the lamb from its mouth. Then it rose up against me, and I would seize it by its beard and strike it down and put it to death. Your servant has struck down both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has reproached the battle lines of the living God. All right, let's stop right there. Saul does what Saul always does. He judges by what he can see. Everybody underestimates David. Only God can see who David really is and who he's going to be. Samuel struggles to see it, but he trusts God. Outside of that, everybody underestimates David. Saul says, listen, kid, thanks for stopping by, but, you're not really exactly what we're looking for. What was Saul looking for? He was looking for a 9'6" Israelite, and he didn't have one. But look at the response. David says a powerful thing here. He begins to tell a story. He said, I've had to fight a lion and a bear who came to steal one of the lambs in my flock. In other words, I was responsible for their protection, and a predator came and stole them away. I tracked him down, I rescued the lamb, and I killed the predator. Now, Yahweh, who delivered me from the hand of the lion and from the hand of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Now, if we have verse 37 without verse 36, we might be tempted to say, well, okay, even if all that's true, as impressive as it is killing a lion, and as impressive as it is killing a bear, the bear you killed and the lion you killed probably don't compare to a 9-foot-tall Philistine with 200 pounds of armor. But see, it's not about comparing Goliath to the predator lion or the predator bear. That's why verse 37 wouldn't stand alone. We need verse 36. He says, your servant has struck down both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine, I love it that he's not obsessed with the anatomical features of Goliath. Don't miss the point. But he adds this adjective, the uncircumcised Philistine. He adds it every time he mentions his name, because in saying it that way, he is emphasizing that this Philistine, this giant, has no claim on the power of the one true God. He's outside the boundaries of those that God shows favor to. But here's the verse. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them. Well, we've already decided, the lion is impressive and the bear is impressive, but the Philistine's not really like them. But it's not a comparison of size. Look at the end of the verse. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has reproached the battle lines of the living God. He's now standing before the king, testifying to the same thing that he said when he was out there among the men of the army. The key here is an uncircumcised Philistine, a pagan outside the favor of God, who by disdain reproached with his curses the army of the true God, the battle lines of the living God, thereby extending that curse to the living God himself. You see, what Saul has missed in this whole episode is that it's not Saul and the army that's fighting this battle. It's the living God. And David is the first one to bring the living God into the equation. And once you bring the living God into the equation, let me tell you, the answer to the problem changes. Verse 38. Then Saul clothed David with his robes and put a bronze helmet on his head, and he clothed him with armor. And David girded his sword over his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. So David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. And David took them off. Then he took his stick in his hand and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in the shepherd's bag, which he had, even in his pouch, and his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. This is why Saul can't be king. Because even with the confidence, the extraordinary confidence of this young boy David, even with the testimony that the key to this issue is his reliance on the living God, Saul can't think outside the box enough to go, hey, maybe God is the X factor in this equation. No. Saul goes, well, if you're going to die, you might as well look like a soldier. My father-in-law told me one time years ago when I was in seminary, he bought me a shirt and some pants because I was learning to play golf. And he goes, well, at least you could look like a golfer. That'll help your self-esteem. But that's exactly what's happening here. Saul is still judging this whole equation by what he can see with his physical eyes. If you're going to go face that giant, I think you can almost see Saul going, we might as well get it over with. It's just a matter of time until the giant defeats whoever we send. We're going to be slaves. Israel's going to come to a crashing end. The Philistines are going to take over. Might as well get it over with. Put on my armor. Here probably had the most impressive suit of armor, weaponry and armor of any soldier in the Israelite army. I mean, that would be appropriate for the king. He dresses David up, still trying to control the situation by what Saul thought was the answer. Now, you got to use your sanctified imagination. David apparently wasn't a big man. He certainly wasn't as tall and as big as Saul. So here's Saul's armor. And I love the way the text says, the Hebrew, it's a literal translation. He got all dressed up and he tried to walk around. But he couldn't do it. I think David understood, the only way I'm going to win this battle is with God. And I'm sure not going to win it walking around in this costume. So he takes it off. And he does what those who are confident in God always do. He took exactly what God had him to take, which was what he knew how to do. He had a slingshot that he was clearly adept with. Why wouldn't he be? I mean, if you're out there with sheep in the middle of nowhere, what would you do? When you were a kid, did you have a slingshot? I mean, we didn't have the kind that David had where you're slinging around, but we had the kind that you pull, and what do? You can find rocks anywhere. Man, we shot at every bird in every tree. We shot at every target we could come up with. Why? Because that's what you do. David had practiced for hours and hours, and he knew that it wasn't just his skill, although this was a skill. He knew it was God. But God always works with what he provides you. David didn't need to go into battle as Saul. He needed to go into battle as David, the shepherd who worshiped God wholeheartedly. Well, he was unshaken by the naysayers. He refused to be dissuaded by Saul. Because David is the only one in this story who's living by the unseen reality of the presence of God. Let me tell you something. If you're walking with God, it's okay for you to be the only one on your team. Verse 41. David walks out there, and I can't read this chapter in the Bible without that veggie-tailed David and Goliath story in my head. Who will I fight? That's the voice of Goliath in my head every time. Verse 41, then the Philistine came on and drew near to David with the shield bearer in front of him. Now, you don't think this is a ridiculous picture? 9-foot tall soldier, 200 pounds of armor, all the weaponry, a different soldier carrying his shield, and a kid with a slingshot. What an absurd picture. In fact, it's so absurd that Goliath is going to take offense at it, as he rightfully should. The Philistine looked and saw David, and he despised him, for he was but a youth and ruddy with a handsome appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. He is losing this battle by the moment. He cursed David by his gods. The Philistine also said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field." You see, all of his intimidating presence, it's been for 40 days directed just generally at the army, the battle lines of the army, and probably a little bit more at Saul somewhere in the background, keeping a low profile. But now, all of a sudden, every ounce of his intimidation is directed full on at David. "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field." Listen, if there's ever a moment where David is going to melt under the pressure, it's right here. He can be bold talking to the troops. He can be bold standing before Saul, but now he sees just how big 9 feet 6 inches really is. That's why I love this answer. Verse 45. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin. But I come to you in the name of Yahweh of hosts, the God of the battle lines of Israel, whom you reproached, whom you cursed. This day Yahweh will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the camp of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that Yahweh does not save by sword or by spear, for the battle is Yahweh's, and he will give you into our hands." Whew. Listen, this kid has some nerve. But you know why he has nerve? Because he knows God. Now, before we get to the battle, let me correct something in your mind about this story. The story of David and Goliath has become a parable in our culture. I mean, even people who have never read the Bible, even people who have no biblical or Christian background, everybody knows the story of David and Goliath. Everybody knows that a kid with 5 smooth stones and a slingshot defeats the most powerful and impressive enemy soldier in the history of warfare. Here's the error of the story, though. In our cultural use of the story of David and Goliath, we love to use this as an illustration of the way we battle the giants in our lives. We always think we're David. David's the hero. And when we associate ourselves with a biblical story, we like to put ourselves in the shoes of the hero. You're not Goliath. I'm not Goliath. But I have to break it to you. We're not David either. You know who we are in this story? We're the Israelite army hiding in their tents, afraid to even go into battle. That's who we are. The story of David and Goliath is the story of God raising up one man who is willing to sell out because he trusts God so completely. Listen, if God doesn't show up, not only is Israel going to be defeated, they're not going to be able to find the remnants of the pulp that Goliath is going to beat David into. But that's not the problem, because David has an unshakable faith. You couldn't see it on the outside. Frankly, he was handsome, but he wasn't overly impressive, wasn't really big, not super strong, pretty simple and straightforward. Saul didn't see it. Eliab, his oldest brother, didn't see it. The other soldiers didn't see it because they were judging him from the outside. But this is a young man who knew that he gets up in the morning and he goes to sleep at night in the presence of the true God. And that makes him invincible. You see, David is not fighting because Goliath insulted him. David is taking a stand because Goliath has insulted Yahweh. Yahweh will deliver you up into my hands. I'll strike you down and I will remove your head from you. Verse 47, Yahweh does not save by sword or by spear. If we could learn this lesson, Yahweh does not solve our problems by the ways of the world. The battle is Yahweh's, and he will give you into our hands. You know, my favorite, I'm running long, my favorite battle scene, frankly, in the whole Bible is King Jehoshaphat. If you don't know anything about Jehoshaphat, go look him up. He's only got about 3 chapters in the Bible. It's not a real long story. But Jehoshaphat is told by God there's an invading army on its way, and God says, get up, put on your armor, line up your troops, march out to the battlefield, and then stand pat. And watch me defeat the enemy. I love that. Can you imagine when Paul in the New Testament talks to us about the armor of God, the breastplate of righteousness, the helmet of salvation, the sandals of peace, when he outlines the weaponry and the defensive armor that we have spiritually with God, he's telling us the same thing that God told Jehoshaphat. Get up in the morning, get dressed, march out to the battlefield, and then watch me win the battle. Watch me fight the fight. Here, David has challenged Goliath, and he says the whole assembly is going to recognize that Yahweh is the winner here. He's going to give you into our hands. Verse 48. Then it happened when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, that David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. The absurdity of this story continues. Here comes the giant, and David runs to the battle. Every Israelite soldier for 40 days has run in the opposite direction. David runs to meet the giant. Verse 49, and David sent his hand down into his bag and took from it a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. And the stone sank into his forehead so that he fell on his face to the ground. Thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and put him to death, but there was no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and put him to death and cut off his head with it. Then the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, so they fled. But the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the valley and to the gates of Ekron, and the slain Philistines lay fallen along the way to Sha'arim, even to Gath and Ekron. You ever wondered if God goes out of his way to give you a giant of a problem? You suspected it, but that's one of those things that we don't say out loud. We're not supposed to accuse God of putting us in tough situations, because we think that makes God look bad. God's trying to teach us to have a self-esteem, to have a confidence to accomplish great things because we serve a great God. He told Gideon to send home thousands of soldiers. Get them down to about 300 and we can work on this. What? 300 soldiers? I had 20,000 soldiers. Now I have 300 soldiers. Oh, wait a minute. 300 soldiers plus God, that's still a majority. Jehoshaphat, put on your armor, march your army out, but don't set foot on the battlefield. You just stand on the edge. Because, see, I'm all you need to win this battle. The Battle of Armageddon. Let's flash forward all the way to the end of the story. You know, we've made movies about the Battle of Armageddon, and it's always this massive fight and this sort of global conflict. You know what the Bible actually tells us about the Battle of Armageddon? It is the most overrated battle in the history of battles, because all of the armies of the world gather together, and then Jesus, merely by the power of his word, wins the battle. There's no massive conflict. There's no conflagration that goes on for days and weeks and months. He shuts down the enemy by the power of his word. What if we trusted God enough to say, God, I'm willing to be in a hard spot, a difficult place, because I'm desperate to see you do a mighty thing through me. Our prayer is, God, keep me out of trouble. God, keep me out of difficulty. God, ease my discomfort. What if our prayer was, God, give me the biggest, baddest battle you've got, and then make me adequate by your presence in my life? Now that's a prayer that'll get you recorded in the Hall of Faith. We're typically not David. We're a cowering Israelite army. But at least to their credit, when one man with an unshakable faith in God stepped up and allowed God to work through him, you know what the rest of the army did? They rallied to the battle. Folks, I don't know who the leaders in this generation will be. I don't know who God will raise up to lead the spiritual awakening that I believe is coming. But when God raises up his man, we are going to hear the shout, and we are going to rally to the battle, and we are going to fight the good fight. There's a whole lot more to this David story. You might think there's no place for David to go but down. Kind of peaked with the battle with the giant. But you'd be wrong. Because when God finds a man who trusts him completely, this story is just beginning of all the things that God is going to accomplish through son number 8, youngest brother, who knows the true God and lives by faith. Father, thank you for your word. What a story this is. As familiar as it is nevertheless fresh and new. It's extraordinary to consider. It's an amazing telling, filled with applications and lessons for all of us. Lord, I pray that while we're probably not David in the moment, we aspire to be David in our lifetime. Find here hearts who will be sold out to you and then do inexplicable things that only you can take credit for. Father, be among the people of Evergreen in power. That's our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.